The leaders of South Korea, China and Japan are set together for a rare trilateral summit in Seoul starting on Sunday. Well, this will be their first talks in more than 4 years. And officials say discussions will focus on restoring and normalizing cooperation between the nations. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol will hold separate bilateral talks with Chinese Premier Li Qiang and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida on Sunday. The leaders are then set to hold a summit on Monday. The East Asian neighbors had agreed to hold a summit annually since 2008, but the initiative was disrupted by diplomatic tensions and the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, an observer highlights the timeliness of the planned trilateral summit amid escalating U.S. pressure with its integrated deterrence strategy.
이 정책은 한국과 일본, 그다음에 대서양 지역에 있는 군사 동맹 국가, 또 오세아니아에 있는 호주와 같은 군사 동맹 국가들을 다 아우르는 형태의 동맹입니다. 이것에 대해서는 중국이 상당히 큰 반발을 하고 있고 여기에 따른 한국과 일본과의 관계 개선은 필수입니다. 그러한 맥락에서 한국과 중국, 그다음에 일본과 중국 또는 중국과 한국, 일본 이 3자가 함께 모이는 자리는 매우 중요하고 이에 대해서 미국과 다른 미국의 동맹국들이 주의를 기울일 수밖에 없는 그런 상황인 것이죠.
For a deep dive in this discussion, let's bring in Dr. Soo Kim, Policy Practice Area Lead LMI in Consulting. We've got CNA's Lim Yoon-suk in Seoul, as well as Michio Ishida in Tokyo. Well, thanks very much for joining us this evening. Let's start with you first, Yoon-suk. What are some of the key expectations and the pressing issues that will be discussed at this
Well, many analysts have said, the fact that the three leaders are finally meeting is progress in itself and significant. And many analysts are saying they are expected to be discussing a wide range of issues, including this people-to-people exchanges, the easier one, and also security and economic cooperation. For South Korea and Japan, this issue of North Korea is very likely and definitely will be coming up as both countries are hoping that China will be able to play a bigger role in trying to get North Korea to give up its nuclear and missile programs, though China is expected to insist, as it has all along, that it is doing its best. Now, this time, apparently, it's not just North Korea's weapons program. Many local reports here are saying that South Korea and Japan could also try to include a clause in a statement that will be released after this trilateral summit on Sunday on the issue of kidnapped nationals from both South Korea and Japan, and also South Korea pushing to try and see if they can get something about its prisoners of war who have yet to return home from Pyongyang. But we will have to wait and see because we know that what China is going to say on this issue, with some analysts who are saying that, this is going to make China very uncomfortable. And so we'll have to wait and see whether it will be on the agenda. But it's interesting to note that those are some of the issues that could come up this weekend.
Now, let's bring you in, Dr. Kim. As what Yoon-suk was saying, speaking to some analysts, that this could sort of make China uncomfortable. This is, after all, part of it is about people-to-people exchanges. So, Dr. Kim, how significant is Premier Li Qiang's first visit to South Korea for the future of China-South Korean relations?
Well, thank you for having me first. So there are a lot of aspirational issues, I would say, that we want to achieve or show some progress. As Yoon-suk mentioned, there are some softer issues such as people-to-people exchanges, economic cooperation. There's even climate change issues. On matters that are more sensitive, such as the abduction issues in China and Japan, and South Korea, it is going to be very testy. And the question of whether or not China is going to be receptive to it, that's also going to be it's going to be up in the air. The significance of the Premier's visit to Korea for the first time, I think, especially looking at where we were in 2019 and beyond. Let's look at how South Korea, Japan, and the United States at Camp David reaffirmed the importance of the trilateral and the way forward for the three countries in light of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, in light of the North Korean nuclear challenge, and of course, in light of China's growing aggression within the region. So this is, I think, timely in the fact that China is becoming much more sensitive not just to the bilateral exchanges, but the trilateral cooperation between Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington. There's a lot of potential there. And the potential, I think, is going to, it's going to look like a zero-sum game for China. And that is why we're going to see a lot of attention focused on the trilateral that's coming up next week.
And Michio, I mean, what about Japan, though? What are its primary goals at this trilateral summit?
Well, Japanese Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshimasa Hayashi said the trilateral summit has not taken place for 4.5 years. The regional international atmosphere has changed greatly since, and it's crucial to set the details on cooperation between the three countries. Now, Japan is the next chair of the trilateral summit, so Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is expected to show his determination for a future-oriented cooperation in a multi-layered way, which the foreign ministry here says, is not only through economic cooperation, but also through people-to-people exchanges, as we were hearing, science and technology, the environment. Now, here's more from Mr. Kishida himself at the Nikkei Forum banquet on Thursday.
多くの新たな課題に地域が直面する中、日中韓プロセスを再活性化させ、地域の平和と繁栄に対する大きな責任を共有する3カ国による実務協力を重ねていきます。
Dr. Kim, to walk us through, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges in terms of trying to achieve a successful outcome at this trilateral summit? You've talked about frosty relations, being a zero-sum game for China, especially after, after more than 4 years since they had the last trilateral summit.
I think the biggest issue here is, of course, the tensions and the ever, I would say, proliferating competition between the United States and China, and especially for countries like South Korea, where you're dependent on one country for your security concerns and the values that are rooted between the two countries with the United States. And then on the flip side, you're also economically dependent on China as your biggest trading partner. The concern there is, of course, that the U.S.-China competition is becoming bigger, and it's becoming more expansive beyond just the implications on immediate countries like South Korea, Japan, but it has regional implications, as we're seeing. And I think the wars that are going on in Ukraine and the Middle East have also shown that we can't really box in bilateral relations and look at it just from a very stovepipe view. So there's a lot of concern there about what the implications are going to be for the three countries. Is South Korea and Japan, are they going to be able to truly balance the relationship between the United States and China? How do you outweigh the benefits between, security, your survival versus economics? They're all very closely intertwined. And for countries that are kind of in the middle between the two countries, it's going to take, I think, a lot of fine balancing, which is why I think there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of expectations that are coming out from this meeting.
Right. So, in other words, you're always walking on a tightrope. Yoon Suk, I just want to touch on what your recent Korean envoy, Cho Tae-yul, he stated that relations with China and the U.S. are not a zero-sum game. How accurate is this perspective in the current geopolitical context based on some of the analysts and experts you have spoken to?
Well, those remarks were made recently during his meeting with his Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi, in Beijing. Now, South Korea may want to maintain this partnership with Beijing, which is South Korea's largest economic partner. But many analysts here are saying that it is going to be very difficult, and it is very difficult now, especially when you have South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol aligning himself very closely with the United States since he took office. And in fact, China has cautioned South Korea about deepening its relations relations with the United States and Japan, stressing how it was and it is straining Seoul-Beijing ties. But in the current situation, at least under this Biden administration, many analysts here don't see this trilateral cooperation between the United States, South Korea, and Japan losing its momentum. And so that brings me, my question to you, Dr. Kim, is, right now we are seeing this close cooperation between South Korea, the United States, and Japan. But I'm just wondering what's going to happen if Mr. Biden doesn't win the U.S. presidential election in November, And as you said, we know that security and economics cannot be separated. So what happens to a country like South Korea, especially its bilateral relations with China?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because we're all kind of curious as to what's going to happen, not just within the economic framework, but where security is going to be for South Korea, let's say, when we talk about the U.S., South Korea, the presence of U.S. forces in Korea, and how the South Korea and Washington are negotiating the special measures agreement to determine how much South Korea is actually going to be paying for the burden or the upkeep of the troops and the maintenance of security on the peninsula. Imagine what that would happen to in a dialogue in a Trump administration where it was not really about really looking out for your allies, but of course looking out for the country's true interests. But it was more of a monetary, kind of cost and benefits relationship. And is that actually going to be working for South Korea? And looking at how Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo have been able to really develop and progress the relationship in the past several years under the three leadership, how is that going to change? So there's a lot of things that are up in the air. How is the momentum of the trilateral that's taking place next week going to be affected by a Trump administration that's not going to be so friendly towards the allies? It's going to be more inward looking. How's that going to play out for the three countries? And of course, where is China going to be in the midst of all of this? Is this going to be an opportunity for Beijing, especially if it's more concerned and sensitive about the growing, the deepening relationships among the three countries? So there's a lot of opportunities, there's a lot of risks. Looking at whether or not this is going to be a zero-sum game for any of the countries, it probably, I would say that it is going to be because, again, going back to the discussion about, security versus economics, how do you determine what's more important? Which country do you align with? And you can't really clearly delineate these relationships. So that's where the complication, I think, resides. And that's going to be much more interesting in the months to come, especially as the United States is gearing up for elections in November.
Now, Michio, as we talked about, security versus economics and, whether it could be a Trump 2.0, whether that's what we're expecting. But how does Japan's strengthening of ties with the U.S., if at all, affect its relationships with China and South Korea?
Well, for Japan, U.S. is its only ally. Naturally, the U.S. is Japan's most important partner. Japan plays host to the largest U.S. Military presence in the Asia Pacific. In fact, ties with South Korea could not have been better at this time round. Mr. Kishida and Mr. Yoon, the South Korean president, had met 9 times face-to-face already. And with the U.S., they've been holding military drills. They plan to hold the first Coast Guard drill next month. And actually, China might not find this very amusing. And we've heard from foreign ministry officials that the Japan-China summit is not in the itinerary yet on the sidelines of this trilateral summit. Now, Dr. Kim, I'd like to ask you a question about Japan-China relationship. Relationship remains sour between the two countries. China has stopped importing Japanese marine products since the Fukushima so-called treated water release last summer. And China has detained Japanese businessmen, and Japanese companies are starting to reduce its presence in China. So looking forward, do you think this trilateral summit will be a breakthrough in terms of relationship between Japan and China at all?
I think looking at the fact that we've had 3 trilaterals, one in 2008, one in 2019, and the third one today, The fact that we have not been able to meet on a regular basis, I believe you were supposed to meet on an annual basis, but due to geopolitics and really just political issues, we have not been able to see much progress in this framework. So to the question about whether this trilateral is actually going to spur or to be a catalyst for substantially improved Japanese-Chinese relations, I'm a bit skeptical just because of the frequency of the meetings that we haven't seen, as well as the other atmospheres that we've mentioned in the discussion, where it's not so clearly, it's not easy to really delineate and separate these issues. They're so intertwined, and especially as China becomes more sensitive and prickly towards any sort of cooperation, not just between Seoul and Japan, but with the United States, there's always going to be that sticking point and that uncomfortable rock that you have to kind of get over. And unfortunately, I think as time evolves, we're going to see more of this friction. We're going to see much more of the polarization amongst the South Koreans, the Japanese, the United States versus China, Russia, and North Korea. So we're going to see, I think, incremental movement. I don't know if that's going to really equate to a real substantial, remarkable progress, though.
All right, we'll be certainly looking out for those pointers when the Trilateral Summit starts on Sunday. Well, thanks very much for your time and thoughts, Dr. Soo Kim, Policy Practice Area Lead, LMI Consulting, and of course CNA's Lim Yoon Suk and Michio Ishida.